Podcasts from the Yorkshire Post.
Welcome to Out Loud from the Yorkshire Post. I'm Sarah Walters, and in this programme I'll be talking to York novelist Fiona Shaw. Shaw turned to fiction after her first published book, which was a critically acclaimed study of her own battle against postnatal depression. Her latest book, Tell It to the Bees, is her third novel. Set in the 1950s, the book tells the story of a young mother who is struggling to keep her world together after the bitter collapse of her marriage and her growing love for another woman. Tell It to the Bees is out now, published by Tyndall Street Press. Tell It to the Bees is your third novel, which again has a historical setting. Why have you gone for that rather than contemporary? Because the storyline would be just as equally powerful, probably, in a modern setting.
I think it wouldn't be quite equally as powerful. One of the reasons I decided to set it back in the 50s was because I wanted to... The question that I had was, what would happen if you were a woman who fell in love with another woman and you had a child? What might happen? What might be the risks? And the risks in the 1950s would be very different from the risks now. So that was the first reason I set it back. Though having done a bit of research, I discovered that I could have set it actually in the 1970s or even the early 80s, and the same risks would have applied. So that was... And I think I also wanted to set it just slightly out of my own lifetime. So I slipped it back into the 50s and didn't put it in the 60s.
Put some distance there.
Yeah.
For anyone that hasn't read it yet, tell us what the story is about.
The story is a three-hander, really, about two women from different sides of the tracks, to put it kind of crudely. One's a doctor, one's a woman who works in an electrical factory. And the woman who works in the electrical factory, Lydia, it's also about her son, Charlie. And in a sense, for me, he's the kind of... For me, reading, and I don't know whether this is the case for the readers or not, you'll have to tell me... he's a bit like a kind of emotional barometer in the way that children can be. So he doesn't literally know what's going on between all the adults, and he doesn't necessarily understand it, but he understands it emotionally, and he doesn't have a language for it, a verbal language, but it's in what he does that we see, in a sense, the impact of what going on between the adults played out through his child's world. And in a sense, he's a mirror for their emotions as well. They see in his innocence reflected back the guilt that they feel. Yes, or the responsibility, or the consequences, I suppose. I'd want to say more than the guilt, simply. But yes.
Was it a difficult book to write?
Some of it was very difficult. Some of it was... I loved writing. I mean, didn't write itself, but it had a kind of energy behind the writing. Some of Lydia's marriage, when the novel opens, is in dire straits, and it doesn't give anything away, I don't think, to say that it's on the rocks. And writing about her feelings about that, her kind of grief and sense of loss, and even though for her there's no other way to go, writing about that was very hard. In the way I think it would be, like anybody else, I've been through difficult times myself, and that was, I suppose, what in a sense I was drawing on. And trying to catch this balance between her sense of grievance and having had wrong done to her, but also by somebody that she really has loved, albeit that she now thinks that's impossible.
There's a real sense of energy in the characterisation of Charlie. Was he fun to write?
Yeah, I loved writing him, and I think my heart, in a sense, is closest to him of any of the characters, and I think he's probably he's drawn more away from myself than... Although he's a boy and I'm a woman, a little girl, there are aspects of myself I know that are in him. So I was a watcher. I loved watching insects. I used to watch ants instead of bees. And I did for a brief time. I'm probably a little bit older than him, about the age of 12. I entertained a real wish to work with insects. So I wanted to be an entomologist, as I discovered it was called. But I was rubbish at drawing, really bad at drawing diagrams at school, and I liked writing stories and loved reading, so I kind of gravitated that way. But it's a kind of career. It's a wish not met or not developed in me. Was there a sense in your choice in setting it in the 50s that his childhood was in a way purer? I think that would be something to say about the whole novel rather than just Charlie and his childhood in it. My novels are moving towards the present day in about 30-year increments. So, but I'm aware that if you write in the present day, then you've got to. If you write a novel that's set now, then you have got to. You can't. Well, maybe some people do write rarefied characters who know nothing about mobile phones, the internet, Twitter, Facebook, or anything. But you would, you have to deal with all that. And so, putting it back in the 50s, of course, I am free not to have to deal with all that if I don't choose to. Yeah.
I mean, he does have an almost idyllic time of it. He meets the doctor, he goes and tends for her bees, falls in love with the garden, and brings the two women together.
It's idyllic, but he has a hard time at school. He gets bullied in ways that will be very familiar to most of us on one side or the other of the situation. He's something of a solitary, but he's also a little bit lonely, I think, and I think the loneliness comes out of what's going on between his parents. So it's idyllic in some ways, and I think it's quite hard in others. So he seems to be a bit on the fringes of things, even when he's with a group of boys in the park. He's sort of on the edge of it. He's not quite in the middle.
Obviously, the relationship between the two women is the central line of the story, and it answers in what I would view as a common misperception in the homosexuality laws, in a sense that some people would believe women had an easier time of it because there wasn't a specific law governing lesbianism. So therefore, behind closed doors, people people turned a discreet blind eye. But of course, that's not the case, is it? Because in a small town, it would have been an absolute scandal.
Yes, it would, and I think that I'm guessing, but from the kind of reading I've done, I think a lot of women would have, in the same way as a lot of men, a lot of women would have found ways to live their lives trying to be true. Would have tried to live their lives true to their own emotional feelings, but they would have done it behind closed doors and very discreetly, and certainly their professions and their lives were at risk. The way they lived their lives was at risk if they were going to be found out. So if you were a doctor, you'd have to be very careful, or if you were somebody in a public profession. But I think also, yes, you said the scandal would have been huge, and that would be generated informally and behind people's hands and in all those other ways, but it would have had a devastating impact on people's lives.
The social history of the book really fascinated me. I really enjoyed the factory scenes where Lydia is working, because in a sense it provides a community that she seems to crave and need, while at the same time obviously throwing up problems for her. What kind of research did you do for that, or was that drawing on research you've previously done?
No, I did quite a lot of research for it. I'm trying to remember the line of... I came across a fantastic book that I think came out in the early 80s, which was which focused on... I can't remember the title now. Focused on about 5 factories, and it was specifically about women's experience of the factory. Factory work and their conditions of work, how easy it was for them to be laid off, what happened when they had kids, what happened when they were ill, the hours they worked, how far they had to travel, all those kinds of details. So it was really useful. It was quite a politically focused book. It was quite a left-wing book, but it had for my purposes, it had fantastic social details. So I made use of that, and I also I remember talking to a friend of mine whose dad worked in a cardboard box factory, so it was, which is not an electrical factory, but was very useful for some of that information. So I scoured the internet for photographs. I think some of the photographs I came across were Australian electrical factories in the 1950s, but I figured they couldn't be too different.
There was also quite a degree of subtlety in the way you portrayed the class tensions, because it went beyond the big house that the doctor lived in to the fact that she loved walking, and she did it for leisure. I mean, it's the kind of thing that we take for granted.
I think, again, it was probably because as you can hear from my voice, I'm thoroughly middle class. I was brought up thoroughly middle class. So it's a combination of a lot of reading and talking to friends. Friends of mine who had very different or whose parents had very different kinds of ordinary lives than my parents had. So we went for walks as children. It was a completely standard thing to do on a Sunday, was to go off for a big round walk with a pub in the middle, which I loved, to drive out from London. But it was not what my friends' parents would have thought of doing. They had leisure time, they wouldn't have done that with it.
You are, of course, no stranger to difficult topics, because your first book was not a fiction. It was about your own struggle with postnatal depression and subsequent breakdown. How did that book come about? What happened?
Out of me. Out of me came about I started writing it, not thinking it was going to be a book at all. I was trying to get my thoughts in order, and it was sort of a year and a half after my second daughter was born, and I was still actually very, very depressed a lot of the time, but beginning to kind of function and live my life. And my memory was really shot to pieces, partly because of the depression, but also because of the ECT, the electroconvulsive therapy I'd had. So I was trying to work out what I remembered and what I couldn't remember, and so I asked friends to help me out with their recollections. I also sent off my medical notes, and I wanted to try and at least put together a story or an account for myself as to why it had happened, or what the connections were between this depression, which seemed to have come completely out of the blue very suddenly, and the memories and preoccupations it brought right bang to the surface from my childhood and adolescence. So it began as a kind of series of notes, and then it became a slightly longer piece, and I thought, well, this would be something that might be worth writing up for a piece in The Guardian or a women's magazine, because it's such a taboo subject. Every woman I've ever met, and myself included, feels terribly guilty. So anything you can put out in the public domain or out in public to say, actually, it's not your fault, or it's not my fault, and to talk about it seems like a good thing. Anyway, it grew, or it became longer and longer, and eventually it was a kind of book-length thing. And so then I set about trying to find an agent and then find a publisher. So it wasn't a book that I planned on. Obviously, I didn't plan on having depression. I certainly didn't plan on writing a book. But that's sort of how it came about.
What was the reaction to people when it became clear that it would be a book? What was people's reactions? Were they like, "Are you sure you want to do that?"
Yeah, I mean, very few people had read it, of course. I mean, the people who had read it were my husband, my agent, a couple of close friends. And I did, when I knew I had a publisher for it, I gave it to my mother to read and my immediate family, because there were things in it that I'd never told them. And they, at the time, then they responded very supportively. That was going to be a year before it came out. When it did finally get published, some of my family found it very, very difficult. And there was a lot of a lot of talking and working out to do between us. Lots of people said, you're very brave to write about this. And I don't think I realised quite how brave it might have been until after the event, because there was a lot of publicity at the time, and most of it very supportive, or saying it's good there's this kind of book out there and so on. But the occasional person came along and interviewed me, and sort of. Then there was one particular piece I remember that almost made out that I was, I'd have been frightened. I was a person that you wouldn't want to meet on a dark night, and I thought, good grief, what are they?
Yeah, the reactions have been quite mixed. I was looking online, and there were a couple of people who said I couldn't even read the book. I mean, is that quite hurtful because you've actually laid yourself open? I think it pulls very raw kind of material things for people. I can't. And it's a very difficult area to talk about. I mean, maternal ambivalence, depression after childbirth, at a time when women are meant to be resourceful for a start, but also, and what you want to be is delighted and thrilled that you have a new child, and here you are feeling absolutely kind of dire. It can make people feel very vulnerable and exposed, I think, if somebody else is saying, actually, I found this really difficult. At what point for you did you realise that there was something wrong?
About 4 or 5 days after Jessie was born, I can remember I was back home, and my husband Hugh and my toddler Eliza we were all at home, and they were going to go out for a walk, and I was going to stay and give Jessie, our little baby, a bath or a feed, I can't remember. And I suddenly was absolutely in a most terrible panic that Hugh was going to leave the house. I was terrified, and I didn't know what I was terrified of, or where it had come from, or what it meant, or anything. And it was sort of around, but it was around that sort of those 4 or 5 days that when she was 4 or 5 days old, that I think I began to realise, and he began to realise that things were not good. I didn't want to go outside. I found it really hard to play with Eliza. I couldn't feed myself. I was just really didn't want to eat. The only thing I would eat or drink was milk, because in a kind of totally illogical but sort of internally logical thing, I thought, well, if I can drink milk for myself, I'll be able to carry on breastfeeding my baby. That was which didn't make any sense, obviously, because I didn't get enough calories from the milk possibly to I mean, I did in fact carry on breastfeeding Jessie. It was one of the few things I was able to carry on doing, but it was tremendously difficult because I wasn't eating remotely enough to nourish myself. So it was pretty soon after, and by the time she was 10 days old, I had a visit from a GP when she was 7 days old, which was really unhelpful. He was very unsympathetic, but it was basically kind of pull yourself together.
Do you think that's a sounds a bit weird, but do you think that's a gender thing or an inexperienced thing or just downright offensive?
I don't think it's necessarily a gender thing, because I met my main psychiatrist was a woman, and she was not wholly sympathetic, I don't think, to the women under her care. I didn't find her so anyway. But I think he didn't like women breastfeeding. I think he thought it kind of got in the way. It was irregular, it was messy. So he didn't see the point of supporting me in breastfeeding. Actually, my psychiatrist did. She did what she could and did successfully support me breastfeeding. So there were good things she did really well, and other things that I thought I could have really done with something else. So I don't think it was simply gender. I think it was also just he had very firm opinions about things, but. But the second GP who came to see me, who was a locum and I'd never met before, was just really impressive. I mean, he was very sympathetic. He listened to me. He didn't, at any point, at no point was he condescending. But he was also, as I realised later from my notes and from a year and a half later, and from talking to Hugh much later too, my husband. I realised that he was really aware of how serious the situation was, so he wasn't going to leave me there, but he also was as supportive as he could be and did his best to say, you're not going mad, you're not stupid, you're not contemptible, all the things that I was absolutely convinced that I was. And at the end of that day I was in a psychiatric hospital, so with my baby.
Well, the stigma of having in-hospital treatment for a mental breakdown or mental illness is, of course, absolutely debilitating in itself, but then, of course, there is the stigma of ECT, which is incredibly controversial still and does provoke absolute horror in many people. How did you cope with the suggestion that you would have to have ECT?
I think by the time they were suggesting it, I was kind of beyond caring. I mean, I really had so little regard for myself. I didn't really care what anybody did. I think it was at that point. It was at the point of decision. The person it was hardest for was Hugh, who was horrified by the idea, but found it unbearable. The state that I was in was unbearable to witness, and couldn't see what else could be done. So at that point, I think it was hardest for him. But the experience of having it is really, my experience of having it was horrible. I think they do. I know from talking to psychiatrists much more recently that they would never give it to you now in a way with so little information. So you'd be much more supported. I mean, the treatment would be the same, and the effects on your memory might well be the same, but you wouldn't. Nobody told us what the side effects might be like. So my memory was completely obliterated. I couldn't remember how to get around the ward, and there was a tiny little unit with 2 bedrooms, a day room, a nursery, and a milk kitchen. That was about it. And I'd forgotten that there was a kind of day room with toys for Eliza to play. I'd been there for 2 or 3 weeks. And so Hugh would have to say, no, we can go into that room over there. And I'd have forgotten about it. And so he took to writing a diary for me every day of who had been that day or what had happened, so that the day after that I could refer back to it. Because I would have, it wasn't like normal, it's not like normal forgetting where you can recover things or there are triggers that you think, oh yeah, that's what happened. It's just complete erasure. And it goes on for months afterwards, after you've finished the treatment. So the most extraordinary occasion for me was several months after I'd had the last of the final treatments of ECT, so it was probably late spring.
How many did you have?
Well, I had about 8 doses of it, I suppose, two a week, which was quite normal, twice a week for about 4 weeks, so it's 8 doses as an inpatient. And then I came out of hospital, and then I went troughed straight back down again pretty quickly, and I was desperate not to be back inside hospital, so I was treated again, but as an outpatient in a different hospital, and I had another 8 doses, so for another kind of 4 weeks. So it was 2 months or so, it was a few months after the last of that lot. Some friends of ours came up to stay from London, and one of my friends said she wanted to go for a walk with me because she wanted to tell me some news, something important. So we went for this walk, and she told me this news, this information, and then we had the weekend, and then they went back down to London again. And I don't remember anything about that weekend. I don't remember any element of the visit at all. And a little while after that, we were talking on the phone, and she said to me, "You remember what I was told we were talking about when I was up in Yorkshire with you?" And I had no recollection of this conversation at all, nothing. And at first she was a bit hurt that I'd forgotten, until she realised that it was not a kind of normal piece of forgetfulness. And so she said, "Okay, well, when you next come to London, we'll have that walk again, and I'll tell you the information again." So we did that, however many months later, or whenever it was that I was next in London. And what she was telling me was that she was going to adopt a child. So it was not the kind of thing you forget. You don't forget that one of your close friends is going to adopt a child. So it was kind of memory loss like that. And ECT does affect everyone differently. Some people have a much worse experience of it than I do, and some people find their memories less affected. I think mine was a kind of middle-of-the-road experience. But it's really... So you have to kind of recover from the treatment as well as from the depression.
I mean, what was the principle of it for someone with postnatal depression? Is it like a computer, they try to reboot?
I suppose that wouldn't be a bad analogy as far as I can find out how they think it works. And nobody really seems to know. What the psychiatrists I've spoken to most recently would say was they don't know why, but it still seems to be one of the only effective forms of treatment for women who are in a certain kind of state. So they're catatonic, they can't speak, or they won't eat, or the people are suicidal. And I was deemed to suicidal, and I was finding eating very difficult. So I don't know why it's one of the things that turns the corner, but it seems to. It seemed to me a bit like being kind of hit over the head with a mallet. It sort of stuns you, and maybe when you come out of being completely stunned, something has shifted. I don't know. So I still can't. I just don't know whether it did turn a corner for me or not. I know that I hated the effects of the treatment, and I think even some information would have helped that.
When did it start feeling better?
Probably. Given it started when Jessie was a baby, it probably started feeling better when she was a year and a half old, 2. I mean, I think that like a lot of depressions, you feel like it's never going to end. You're never going to be out of this blackness, and then it lifts, and you think, "Thank God for that. I'm enjoying sitting having this cup of tea with this friend, or I'm enjoying bathing my kids, or it's possible to get up in the morning without feeling utterly despairing." And then you go down into the kind of mire again, and it feels like it's going to be endless, but the mire that time doesn't last for quite so long before you seem to surface again. So the intervals change, and so it's not that it goes on a kind of gradual. You don't go on a gradual ascent, or I didn't go on a gradual ascent. It's that the periods of terrible despair seem shorter. That's more like the kind of pattern of it for me.
Does postnatal depression tarnish the relationship with a child, or in the end does it bind you closer?
I don't think it probably does. I don't think you could say that it does one thing or the other. I think it will depend entirely on the individual person and their children, and how the kind of support they have from the people around them as well. It does leave you with a lot of guilt, and that can be. I think that's a terrible thing for the mother, and it can be a terrible thing for the children too. So it's very important. It seems to me very important that you have. That you get if people can get support in trying to understand their own behaviour in whatever the way they want to understand it, and to come to terms with what's happened as being something that they're not guilty of. That's probably one of the most important things.
Is it a subject that you would perhaps return to in fiction rather than non-fiction, or is it too close to home now?
I think writing out of me was enough. I didn't think that after writing out of me and after the publicity, I really was happy to turn and write novels and get away from it all. But I did then, a few years, not that many years ago, there was a NICE guideline being drawn up, a development group on anti and postnatal women's mental health, and somebody drew my attention to it, and they were looking for patients to sit on it. They always have patients and carers on guidelines. And so I applied to do that, and so I did then sit on this NICE guideline for 2 years. We used to meet every month, and that felt like a really positive thing to do. But I couldn't have done it in the years immediately afterwards. It was too close. I was too raw.
Is fiction for you a form of escapism, or a way to examine the themes and the issues that everyday life throws up?
Both, I think.
Have you always done that?
No, I didn't write. I wrote stories when I had to for homework as a child, but I wasn't one of those writers who wrote copiously through their childhood at all. And then I wrote some terribly bad poetry when I was a teenager.
Angst-ridden.
Yeah, completely. You know, I've still got it somewhere, and I've never shown it. I would never ever show it to anybody. God help me if my children ever come across it. They'd be very scathing. They're much too experienced readers and writers of their own now. But so I didn't write, and I did an English degree and I wrote a PhD on Elizabeth Bishop's, a wonderful American poet. So I was writing that kind of writing. But I think it was writing out of me that made me think, actually, I really would like to carry on writing, but I'll write fiction from now on.
So what was the idea that spurred the first novel?
Well, the first novel actually is still under my desk. Never got published. And the first novel was, my very first novel was a kind of fascination with my grandparents' lives. So quite common, I think, for first novels. It was mining territory very close to home. All my grandparents were in Malta before the war, and one set of them, my father was born in Malta. I mean, they were quite separate, the grandparents, but they were all both grandfathers were in the Navy, one in the Merchant Navy and one in the Royal Navy. So I wrote a first novel that began in Malta before the war and then spanned the war and came out the other side. And so that was the territory for the first novel.
As well as the historical setting, are there any other recurring themes in your books? Or do you try to find something new to stretch yourself each time?
Yeah, both, probably. Again, I think explicitly I definitely try to find something, well, not try to find something new, something new arises, and I think I really want to write a novel about that. Having said that, I know that things recur because people tell me that and point them out. So this latest book, for example, I love birds anyway, but this latest book, there are very few birds in it because it's been pointed out to me there are a lot of birds in my previous novels, particularly my second novel. So I thought I really have to stop my characters seeing birds around the place because they're not me, and that's not exactly a theme, but it's a kind of motif, if you like, that's making its way directly from my own observing of the world to my characters.
Are there more of your own personal characteristics that are creeping into the books as well? Do people go, oh, by the way?
Yes. God, you do that like Charlie. No, I think that speak for myself, as a writer, I do make my way into my books unavoidably because I'm writing them. But I don't think, some writers say, oh yeah, I modelled so-and-so on such and such a person I knew, or I don't do that. It's not how it works for me. But I guess there are all kinds of characteristics. I think I'm probably not the person to point them out, though. I think it would have to be somebody who knew me and read my novels who would do that.
Where is your writing career going? Are you going to branch off? Are you going into crime fiction or anything like that?
No, I love reading crime fiction, and I have tried to write it. I've tried to write it in the past, and I never got further than trying to plot it, and discovered I don't think I can plot it. I don't plot like that. So I think I would end up with what I found I was ending up with. It just even trying to plan something was a lot of red herrings and no main story. I couldn't work out how to get I couldn't know how to get the gun to the murderer at the end of the story. So I think I decided at some point that I was going to have to content myself reading it and writing the novels that I do write.
So what are you working on now?
I've just started another novel, which isn't actually set in a range of time, so it does does finally make its way into the present day in one section. But it's very, very early days, so I don't know what it'll surface out really.
You're going to read me a section from Tell It to the Bees. What's the section you've chosen?
I've chosen a section, about a quarter of the way through the book, and it's a little chapter of its own, which comes just after Charlie, my 10-year-old boy, has met Jean, who's the doctor. They've met in her doctor's surgery, and he's been to see her because he's hurt his ribs. And they've discovered that he's fascinated by the idea of the beehive. She keeps bees, and so she's invited him to come and see them. So the bit I'm going to read is Charlie's visit to to see the bees. The doctor's house was huge, big as a ship, big as a castle, all on its own with its own hedge around and a driveway with gravel that wouldn't last a minute if it was on his street. Butterflies kicked up a storm in Charlie's stomach. What if she didn't remember him? What if she didn't really mean it? He nearly turned around and went, except that a big lady saw him and marched at him like a tank, and so he froze instead of running. She wore a thin coat like Auntie Pam did, over the top of everything else, so he could see her dress peeping out at the top and from underneath. You could get an electric shock off Auntie Pam's, and when she stood under the electric light, the coat shone like plastic. This lady's had a pattern on it that looked like tongues in blue and red that swirled and flipped about in the wind. "It's not that anyone's ill," he said. "It's about the bees. She said I could see the bees." And Mrs. Sandringham got him by the collar and took him round the side of the house and shouted for the doctor. She was wearing old trousers and a pullover with holes, and she had a scarf around her head. When she got nearer, he saw she was smiling. "Charlie Weeks, I'm glad you're here," she said. "Come and see what's going on." The bees had things to fear in the winter. Mice which crept in at the door and ate their sweet food, woodpeckers that could shred the hive to splinters, canny blue tits that came tapping at the entrance to snap up any curious bees. Dr. Markham told Charlie how the warm February sun could lure them from the hive with a promise like the Ice Queen, then freeze them to death. How they could lose their way home in the snow, bewildered by its brightness. He watched her heft each hive to know its weight, and she told him how careful you must be, when it was still wintry, not to disturb the bees or they might kill their queen, though she didn't know why. She gave him a notebook with a red cover and a leather loop to hold the slender pencil. "Might be useful," she said. He wrote down that a slice of onion was good for bee stings. He wrote down that bee stings were good for arthritis. He wrote down that honey was heavier than water. He wrote down that you could talk to the bees and tell them about important things, but you must do it quietly, else they might fly away. Before he left that day, Charlie ran back to where the hives stood. The doctor hadn't told him how he should speak, and he wasn't sure how near to be, or what he should say. So in the end he stood at one side and put his head close, as if listening at a door. Covering his mouth with his hand, he told the bees he would be back next weekend, and that he was glad now about the fight at school. Then, very quietly, he told them that his mum was sad, but he didn't know why.